Chapter 14 of Tractate Shabbos begins with a discussion on trapping or bruising the 8 sharatzim, 8 special creeping animals whose carcasses can convey impurity. The translations of the animals aren't 100% certain, but they are probably a rat, a mouse, a toad, or possibly a ferret, a hedgehog, or possibly a porcupine, or beaver, a chameleon, a lizard, a snail, or a slug, and a mole. Trapping or bruising them makes you liable on Shabbos. You're exempt for bruising other vermin, but trapping them is not allowed, if it's for a positive purpose. Elsewise, you're exempt. Animals or birds that are under your control, you're exempt for trapping them, but liable for bruising them. The Gemara says that the implication is that all of those 8 sharatzim creatures have hides in regards to the laws of Shabbos. There's arguments if this applies and by laws of impurity. In regards to other vermin, we said you're liable for bruising them, but of course you're liable for killing them. Some hold otherwise about a louse, which they say doesn't reproduce. Others disagree, saying a source that lice lay eggs, but the other opinion still argues, saying that eggs of lice is just the name of a species. Regarding a flea, some say you're exempt from trapping it, others disagree. Everybody says you're liable for killing it. The point we said on trapping only applying for a positive purpose is like the opinion that doing a labor not needed for a defined purpose makes you not liable. This is discussed. In regards to killing the fish, some say it's considered dead after removing it from the sea, if there's a dry spot of a certain size on it. Some say the spot must be between its fins. Others say it doesn't even need to be dry, it's considered dead if there's bits of slime if you touch it. Similarly, one opinion said that if you reach inside an animal on Shabbos and dislocate its embryo, you're liable of a subcategory of reaping. Reason is because you're uprooting something from its place of growth even though it's not touching the ground. You'd be similarly liable for detaching a fungus from a pitcher. Some say this doesn't apply where it's not the thing's usual place of growth, such as a plant in a flower pot without a hole. Some say you can write tefillin on the hide of a kosher bird even though it's full of holes as the ink doesn't seep through them. This is discussed further. We don't know if this applies to a kosher fish, and if the fish skin's smell has departed for this to be allowed. There's a story in this regard where a man badgered a sage with many questions, some of which were in this regard, so the sage cursed him. The sage was also being hosted by a different sage, who was feeding him in a way to help his illness, but he didn't realize as it made him sick, so he cursed the sage to not be survived by his sons, and then realized his mistake. So the other sage only ended up having daughters. It discusses some points further and more on which hides make kosher tefillin. New Mishnah. No preparing brine on Shabbos, but you may prepare salt water to dip bread into or to add to cooked foods. Others say you can only make salt water if you add oil first. The Gemara explains the difference between brine and salt water, that brine is a lot of salt water and salt water is a little. Others take issue with these cases. Another point is taught that you can't make strong salt water on Shabbos. Strong salt water is that an egg will float in it, for fish brine, which is 2/3 salt. There's argument if you can salt a radish. There are further points. In regards to salt water, some say that no one has ever sunk in the Sea of Sodom if they would have sunk on a regular ocean. There's an opinion that you can wash with this water on Shabbos, along with some substances you can't put in your eyes on Shabbos as they constitute a medical practice. Things like wine and raw saliva. It also lists a few medical practices of those times in this regard. This goes further, listing many more medical practices. New Mishnah. Some medical procedures not allowed on Shabbos. No eating certain types of hyssop, which is eaten by unhealthy people. You can eat any food or drink for healing on Shabbos, but not palm tree water, a potion of sterility, which are used for treating jaundice. You may, however, drink palm tree water out of thirst and anoint yourself with root oil if it's not for healing. The Gemara goes on a lengthy sequence of listing medicinal foods, their uses for certain illnesses and ailments, and similar concepts and practices, things like worms, drinking uncovered water, and a snake bite. There's also what to do if a snake wraps itself around you, if it's chasing you, and many such situations. It lists more medical foods. Then it lists even more medical illnesses and the practices for curing them. New Mishnah. If you feel pain in your teeth, no drinking vinegar through them. You may drink vinegar in a regular manner, and if it cures you, then great. If your loins hurt, no putting wine or vinegar on them. You may use oil, but not rose oil. Princes can use rose oil, as that's what they usually use. Some say all Jewish people are like princes, so they can use rose oil on Shabbos. The Gemara argued when vinegar is actually good for your teeth. There's argument on this and the usage of rose oil. And that's the end of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Tractate Shabbos, further going through the 39 forms of work on Shabbos, now on tying knots. The knots you're liable for tying and untying were known as the driver's knot and the sailor's knot. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that a knot that could be untied with one hand you're not liable for. The Gemara describes these knots, and if a bow knot is allowed, that stands unresolved. New Mishnah. Knots you're not liable for are at the front of a shift, a hat string, a girdle, shoe or sandal straps, wine and oil canteens, or a cloth pot cover. There's an opinion that you can tie a rope in front of an animal stall so the animal can't escape. The Gemara discusses these and teaches that these are all necessary to be taught. to include if the opening to the garment has 2 straps, one of which could be left tied permanently by the shift, and a hat is allowed as it will be untied before removal to not mess up the woman's hair. There's further discussion on the topic of shoes, what if they break while walking, and on the subject of chalitza, a later topic. This is discussed at length. We need to teach that the canteen was allowed, to teach that it's permissible even if there's 2 flaps, one of which could be left tied permanently. A similar logic by the pot lid, which has a spout, so you might have thought that the knot would be permanent as you'd empty it through the spout. The same principle applies by the animal stall. It's allowed even though there might be 2 ropes, one of which will be left permanently tied. We rule like the opinion that allows you to tie the stall shut. New Mishnah, you can tie a pail with a girdle, and there's disagreement if it's allowed with a rope. Rabbi Yehuda says a general rule, which is that you're not liable for a non-permanent rope. The Gemara says that the rope in question is weaver's rope, which will be untied. This is discussed further on similar topics and about weaver's implements. New Mishnah, you can fold a garment many times, even 4 or 5, and you can prepare beds on Shabbos night for Shabbos day, but not on Shabbos day for the night after Shabbos. There's an opinion which states that you can fold garments and prepare beds on Yom Kippur for Shabbos the day after. He also holds that you can offer fats from the Shabbos sacrifice on Yom Kippur, but not vice versa. A different opinion allows neither sacrifice swap. The Gemara qualifies the point on folding your clothes, saying, not with 2 people folding, not with old clothes, and not with colored clothes, and not if you have other clothes to change into. There's an opinion that you should wear nicer clothes on Shabbos, and if you have none, then wear your weekday clothes in a non-working manner, meaning don't have them hitched up. This isn't considered to be disrespectful, as you're only doing it on and for Shabbos. It lists some verses about respecting Shabbos. It also gives many instances of this, such as walking in a proper manner. It also says not to eat the dust of Babylonia, also called shinar, as all the dead of the flood were dumped there, and it's bad for your health. It gives further instances of dressing well on Shabbos based on some verses. It also expounds some verses from the book of Rus. This goes further, and there's points on the proper dress code of a Torah sage to look proper and respectable. There's more on folding garments. It also mentions the point of the shofar being sounded to let people know before Shabbos, and whether or not that happens when Yom Kippur falls out on Friday, which is debated. There are further points on what's not allowed on Yom Kippur. Some say you're allowed to start preparing fruit and similar before Yom Kippur ends. Some say it's to increase your distress during the fast, some say it's to decrease it. There were instances of some sages doing this, but people started doing it too early, so they began prohibiting it. And that's the end of chapter 15.